¿Hablas español o no? Sí. No.
Claro, yo de italiano.
¿Ah, sí? Yo no. Solamente español, chino y inglés. And my husband speaks all the
Nice.
So he speaks French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and a little Romanian.
So I told you to trust me. I will find
Yes.
a solution.
Yes.
It's not because I didn't tell you that
Yes.
it's not happening.
Yes, I know, but because it's really made me so uncomfortable, I just thought I can't be so uncomfortable. So it worked out.
Are you ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go.
Excellent. Welcome, everyone. Make everybody sit down. For those of you online, we're just getting the room together. I wanted to give a brief introduction. My name is Rama Danajevic, and I am the Global Impact Partnership lead at Autodesk. And as we're in the building pavilion, I'm hoping everybody already knows who Autodesk is, but just in case, we're a 3D design and make software company. Designers, engineers, builders, creators trust us to help them design and make anything. Think about the buildings we live in, work in, the roads and bridges we drive on, and even the entertainment that inspires us. Autodesk plays a role in all those industries. Our platform unlocks the power of data, helping to accelerate insights and automate processes. This technology empowers our millions of customers to create the world around us and achieve better outcomes for their businesses and for the planet. The focus of this pavilion is crucial that we address the elephant in the room. 42% of global greenhouse gas emissions in the built environment is simply too much. We can't ignore that level of responsibility and the action that we need to take through radical collaboration. Only by working together can we significantly reduce these emissions and create a more sustainable future. Collaboration, as I think a lot of people have been saying, but collaboration is the new competitive advantage. This year, in conjunction with some of the most important companies in the AEC industry, we decided to rigorously and transparently address one of the major contributors to global greenhouse gas emissions in the built environment, embodied carbon. One of the key issues we face is lack of agreed upon processes for measuring embodied carbon. These upfront emissions contribute about 13% of annual GHG emissions, and these emissions will be responsible for half of the entire carbon footprint of new construction between now and 2050. Which brings me to today's program, which I hope you'll find informative and enlightening. We're going to kick off the session with a fireside chat about the importance of consistency in measuring carbon across the whole life of buildings with key players in this space, RICS, ICC, Holcim, Arup, and it'll be moderated by Roland Hunsinger, the Director of the Built Environment at WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And then we'll have an esteemed international panel joining us virtually and in person to discuss a deep dive into how a group of companies conducted a proof of concept to address embodied carbon assessment complexity. We believe this session is essential for anyone committed to reducing the carbon footprint of buildings and figuring out how to simplify processes across the industry. Finally, I will welcome Roland back to the front of the deck for a quick concluding conversation about how collaboration is displacing differentiation as a competitive advantage. And now I'll hand the reins over to Roland to kick off the first discussion.
Thank you very much, Rama, and thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure on the last day of the Buildings Pavilion. Thank you for the introduction on the issue of radical collaboration and market transformation. This topic is really, for us, a critical one because it's at the heart of changing decision making, so that those 40% of carbon emissions, that we really understand them, that we measure them, and hence are able to reduce them in a holistic way. The challenge in the building sector is that it's very fragmented, so different players, different organizations looking at pieces of it, but we talk about whole life carbon emissions because we really need to understand for every building, also infrastructure, what really goes into it in terms of the energy that's consumed, the materials, etc. And then we can holistically reduce that. We need to halve by 2030, and we need to be fully decarbonized by 2050. So I'd like to manage this first panel just to talk about the importance of whole life carbon. It's kind of an acronym, WLC, and gets some people very excited. But why is it really that important? So if I may ask my panelists to join me now on stage, and I think I have all your titles except one. Tim Smith, you're the head of thought leadership and analysis at the Royal Institute for Chartered Surveyors. Ryan Colker, Vice President Innovation at the International Code Council, the ICC. Noura Tantawi, Public and Corporate Affairs at Holcim. And Melanie Yan Singh, Lead Technical Energy Advisor. And I think you've changed the department. I think I have your old department. It's the Net Zero, Energy Security and Net Zero Department of the UK government. So thank you very much. I will ask 2 rounds of questions. I'd like to ask you, because we're just a warm-up, and we will get then into a much deeper discussion with Rama and the firms that have done all this work. If you wouldn't mind giving a relatively short answer on the first one, and then maybe elaborate a bit more on the second one. So I'd like to start with you, Melanie. Can you explain to us what whole life carbon is? And that may need a longer answer. And can you tell us more about your experience with whole life carbon based on your findings and the engagement of the whole life cycle policy group that you have been leading under the Global ABC?
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Laurent. Just a question before I start. Who here hasn't heard of whole life carbon? Online. Oh, right. Okay. Because I was like, so how much do we need to say? Whole life carbon basically is just the framework that we're thinking of all the emissions associated with the built environment and with a building project or construction project, and that includes the embodied emissions in the construction materials, and the emissions in building a building, and then in using and operating the building, replacing elements that need repairing, like you might fit out like the building pavilion. We're refitting it every year, and then demolition and end of life, and and the emissions associated with that. So the whole life carbon is just all the carbon, everything. And that's a result is really important because we want to get to net zero and we want to reduce all of the emissions. But the challenge is, it's really hard to measure everything, and everyone wants to measure everything, and if you're really good at measuring, you measure a bit more, and if you're a bit bad at measuring, you measure a bit less. So that's the challenge is, we want to limit them so that everything is lower, but everything means different to everyone else because some people see a room and see just the walls, and some people see a room and see behind the walls. And so, yeah, that's a challenge. And in the UK, there's more and more importance on, and you told me to be brief, so I think I've explained whole life carbon. And I forgot the second half of the question.
No,
that was it. Okay.
Absolutely.
Great.
No, excellent. I mean, we can talk afterwards about the coalition you're working with, but then more in the next steps. I think you're making a really important point, the simplicity ultimately versus the complexity, which is definitely an area we need to look at as we look forward. Noura, I would like to turn to you. Why is this whole life carbon topic so important for the private sector, and particularly a company like Holcim? And why do we need to harmonize whole life carbon accounting?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I don't want to be repeating what Melanie said, but actually the whole life carbon approach is not only important for the private sector, but in general, if our aim is to improve the sustainability of the built environment, right? And in particular, is to improve also the CO2 emissions and footprint of the built environment. So there are many factors that are to be considered in this. And they include from the design of the building to the sourcing of the materials to the frequency of repair that we need to do to this building later. Even the lifespan and the durability of the asset itself also affect that. So what matters actually is the life cycle performance that a building or an asset has to achieve in order to be in line with 1.5 degree scenario. Now, to the most, this I think you know already, but the more interesting part is concerning Holcim and why a company that is a material provider is also, this is relevant to us and important to us. This is because of the material choice has to also adopt the same holistic approach when looking into the matter. All sustainability aspects have to be considered when we do our design and material choices. For example, if we choose the right material and we design it in the right or adequate way, this will determine the energy consumption of the building in the future, and hence its CO2 performance as well. The durability and the robustness of the material that we choose also determine the frequency of repairs, of how many of the maintenance of this building and its durability as well. So this is why it becomes important to be material agnostic and to focus only on how the material will serve the cause and will serve the overall sustainability and environmental performance of that building. I mean, on the challenges, I think there are people here on the panel that can probably talk better than me on this. I think that data is really important, and back to our discussion last night with Rama, when we talk about the parameters, the number of parameters, and you touch upon it, Melanie, the number of parameters, they require a lot of data, a lot of tools, what methodology, how to harmonize this methodology. All these are challenges, but I will stop here because you said short and I wasn't short, and because there are people that can speak better about it than me. Thank you.
You speak very well about it, and your points are extremely important, so I didn't want to cut you too short. But I think you said some really important things. Whole life carbon is because it looks really also at the full life cycle. It is very important how we build, but if we only focus on embodied carbon, we would only put single pane windows. I always use that example. That's how you minimize the carbon from windows, but then you have a bad energy performance of the buildings, and then you need too much energy. So absolutely, and for materials the same, because you help achieve that energy performance and also over the whole lifetime. So it all needs to be considered in one. And we'll come to the challenges, I'm sure, and we'll discuss them widely. Now, Tim, not sure RICS still needs to be introduced, but I would like to ask you to briefly tell us more about your work and role at RICS on whole life carbon, and what is actually at stake at the moment when we talk about carbon assessment.
Okay, so for those that don't know, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, commonly known as RICS or RICS in old language, 145,000 members globally. We created a whole life carbon assessment methodology back in 2017, but we updated it last year with a second professional statement, as we like to call it in our parlance. I think the second edition, as we were discussing yesterday actually, is more practical, and actually it takes all the modules A to D, and you can actually assess the whole life carbon across the life cycle of a building, and it's got 19 typologies, so actually the scope of it is pretty huge. You know, it brings in infrastructure. I think what's at stake is that the thing that we've realized is that there's so many different methodologies, and that drives inconsistency. And actually there's no real framework for reporting carbon when you measure it across the life cycle. So actually what we want to do is actually bring together industry, policymakers, other institutions and professional bodies to actually agree a common framework of how we report, measure carbon across the life cycle. We realise that there's different contexts, whether it's global north, global south, different carbon factors, different ways that it performs in different locations. But actually what we need to do is compare apples with apples. Like, that's what we need to do. Like, Nigel talked about it yesterday, like even in our 90 different locations, he's sitting over there by the way, there's so many different ways that people measure people, not just organizations, people measure carbon across the life cycle. So what we need to do is get to one common framework, harmonize, build capacity, because actually one thing that we realized, and as our sustainability report came out yesterday, more people are actually measuring embodied carbon, because operational carbon, I think we're doing well on that. But the thing is, there's not enough people doing it. There's not enough skills. And actually, if we're going to do this in the global south, it's like, yes, come up with a framework, that's great. But actually, how do we empower and build the capacity and capability in those countries to be able to do it? So I think what's at stake is, let's do this properly. If we don't, then we're not actually going to be able to manage carbon reduction. We're not going to be able to report carbon reduction. And at the end of the day, if we're talking about getting to near zero by 2030 and then net zero by 2050, if we're not measuring whole life carbon in a consistent way, we're not going to do that.
Excellent, thank you so much. And I think we'll come back to these topics in the discussion on next, particularly your point on the inconsistency and how we really drive that accuracy. But I'd be interested then also the discussion on the skills and capacity. Especially as we hear a lot, Global North can do this, but what about everybody else? Maybe for afterwards. Brian, International Code Council, together with ASHRAE, you are actually developing a standard on whole life carbon. It's called the 240p. Can you tell us more about this standard? And maybe not everybody is familiar. How is it different or complementary to the work of the RICS? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Roland, and really appreciate the opportunity. Really sort of building off of what we've already heard, let me give you sort of an intro to ICC and sort of why this issue is particularly important and why we feel like a standard is sort of the basis for helping move forward. So ICC is really focused on solutions to help support achievement of safe, sustainable, and resilient buildings and communities. And so sort of the core mechanism that we use to be able to do that is through things like codes and standards. And then really sort of the supporting framework that actually makes them work. And so really engaging with architects, engineers, and policymakers to really set the criteria for how are we actually managing and measuring sort of key issues within the built environment. And as we've already heard, we've focused for a long time on sort of the operational side of the picture, and we're really sort of starting to optimize, sort of how we use energy in buildings. But as we continue to decarbonize, as we continue to sort of reduce the impact on the operational side, the embodied piece becomes even more and more important. And sort of the way I like to think about it is sort of how do we optimize sort of solutions across all of those different, sort of A through D. If we were just to focus on one sort of segment or slice and really optimize that, we may not and probably are not getting to sort of where we need to be at the entire sort of building level impact. And so, ICC and ASHRAE, who's another sort of standards development organization that works and engages, sort of folks from primarily the AEC community and the regulatory community, really recognized a need for sort of a methodology that really sort of sets up how do we actually sort of bring those calculations, across A through D, so we do have sort of that complete picture. I think the sort of maybe not distinction, but sort of different angle that sort of RICS's work and the ICC ASHRAE work is a little bit on sort of perspective and audience. So RICS focuses a lot on sort of the folks that work within sort of the quantification space. And so being able to sort of provide maybe to sort of the personnel, the sort of how you do it from sort of the individual perspective. Whereas, sort of the ICC ASHRAE effort is really sort of on the technical basis. So then how do you sort of bring that together into a way that could be brought into building codes or regulatory decision making? I will say that, throughout sort of this process, we've had sort of stakeholders that have been involved in both processes, but also then bringing in some of the work that's happening in the EU, in ISO and others, so that we do have sort of this common basis and common ability to sort of work across, all of our methodologies to assure that we are not creating, more and more confusion and actually sort of getting to where we need to be.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let me try to understand the RICS maybe more for the practitioner the people doing it, doing the work quantification, the standard you're working with, ASHRAE, could then be used for codes, regulations, so more the technical underpinning of that. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, and exactly. And I think the sort of other important piece is, part of, before we start to set sort of targets and requirements, we need a basis for benchmarking. And so ideally, ASHRAE ICC 240 would be that mechanism so that we get that commonality so we can start talking about what are those key benchmarks.
Thank you. So now, going forward, looking what needs to happen next. Currently, even within firms, you're saying people use very different methodologies, and then across firms even more. Do we need to move towards one single thing, or are we moving towards something that is maybe creating comparability, and how? So I'd like to dig a little bit more into that with two very simple questions. What do we need to do collectively now to address this? And can we set ourselves a kind of a goal, maybe for COP30 or within a year? What can we actually achieve? And then afterwards we'll go into the practical work that some of these companies have done. But I think just to set the scene would be really good for us. Do you want to get started there?
Yeah. I think, if you can hear me, here we go. It's like, how do we actually bring together organizations both on the standard setting perspective, technology, so Autodesk and those likes, and then the firms, to actually agree how we can start to harmonize this and not, for me, it's not competing, it's being complementary. And I think that's the thing, that's the key. We all know that we're not going to just create this mono system that, in some kind of communist state, which like, this is how we're going to do it. So, but I think discussing with Mel yesterday, actually, let's go back to basic principles and start the task. So let's take module A and let's work out how we can harmonize that first, instead of being like, right, let's all do A to D, because that is just too broad at the moment. It's like, let's take A, and by COP30, let's bring everyone on the journey with us. So the Arabs, the ACOMs, the Rambols, the Autodesks, ICC, RICS. Let's go on this journey over the next year and decide how we can do that. And then get to COP30 with something actionable and practicable that we can actually launch and say, this is how we do it.
Thank you. That sounds very good. Would anyone like to react? You support, you challenge?
Yeah, but of course support. But I come from a materials provider, so maybe the perspective is a bit different. And also I have the feeling that sometimes, because we are a little bit far in the value chain, so we are not so much in the same level of discussions. But what I can say from our perspective as a materials provider, the best thing we can do and to bring to the table is reliable and robust data about our products. So this is number one. This is why we make APTs for our products, and this is why this is important to have this transparent transcript of the environmental performance of our products. I think this is something that we can already bring to the table. Beyond that, Holcim specifically, we like to engage. We love collaboration, right? We like to be here, to be present, to bring something to the table, to look at the bigger picture, and to try to change things collectively. And this is through the collaboration with you guys as actors in the value chain, but also engagement with city mayors, with governments, also to push to these ideas, to push to this, to integrate it in policies and frameworks and so on. And one last thing that we don't talk about it much, and we appreciate it in the company, and I like it about my company, is research. Is that we also need to support research, and the way we can, as a company, big company, support research is either by funding or by joint programs and for our research department with a university or things like that. And we have a good example in the US where the Holcim Foundation, they collected all the value chain actors with the University of Columbia, and they are trying to make a study or find a way to decrease the embodied carbon in buildings in the US in the short term, and they funded the selected project. So things like that I think are important. And just one last note, and I echo what Ryan said, that embodied carbon were not traditionally very looked at, but the more we have energy efficiency in building, the more they will gain in proportion and importance. And this is why the more and more we need to bring them to the table. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. No, absolutely. And I think Rama said it at the beginning. Half of future carbon emissions is from embodied. So if we discount what has happened going forward, so absolutely to your point, this is really coming to the front. Maybe on the city side, I was very or the public procurement side as well. I was very encouraged this week. One Planet Network launched this framework for sustainable public procurement that includes that requirement for whole life carbon assessments. So I think our audience is there. I'm just putting that out there. So yeah, Melanie.
Just want to first start by saying I don't have a headset on, but this is all music to my ears. Agree with everything you guys have said. And on public procurement, it's a really good point. So the Priority Action launched the public procurement thing, which says we should do, as a key point, the IDDI, which is the Industrial Deep Decarbonisation Initiative that the UK co-led with India and started it 3 years ago. And that's the prism through which us, the UK government, have joined this discussion. And if I feel like most people haven't heard of the Industrial Deep Decarbonisation Initiative, it's a government-led initiative that runs under CMMI, so the Clean Energy Ministerial, and it's a pledge that has 4 levels. The first is to measure emissions and report emissions of steel and cement in all public procurement. The second is to require whole life carbon assessments for all public procurement. The third is to procure low emission steel and cement by 2030, and then in the future is to procure near zero steel emission and cement. And so it's through that prism that there is the why of why do we want to align. So we started with steel and cement, and so I've been part of working groups for the past 3 years with the Industrial Deep Decarbonisation Initiative to align how we measure steel and cement emissions, because these are internationally traded. And EPDs, we're talking about variability at a building level, which is obvious, but even at a small level like a product, and between steel and cement especially. And so what we've been trying to do is find out where does the disalignment matter. And so the IDDI Secretariat published last year a white paper saying these are the 7 points where disalignment matters, and these are the 7 things we need to work on. So now we've started procuring last year a research project, comparing the different standards and looking at how much does it matter. So people say, oh, you can't compare because the results will always be different, but we didn't know how much by, and therefore you don't know if this is just people saying you shouldn't do it because it's too difficult, or people saying actually it actually is really difficult, and therefore we need to focus our efforts on the really bit that matters rather than trying to align everything, because we're never going to use the same database. It's not very hard to achieve that. Data flows across multiple flows. We're not going to have one global database that feeds into every database. However, maybe that's not what matters. Maybe some specific data matter more than others. And so I think with this approach of trying, and so with steel and cement, because they're internationally traded and we wanted to define what low emission steel and cement was and near zero emission steel and cement was, we started with that. But now we've joined the Buildings Breakthrough, and it's about saying we have a vision for near zero emission and resilient buildings by 2030 to be the new normal. To make that the new normal, we need to know what near zero emissions buildings mean. Again, that's why we need to align on a framework. And so when we remember the why we're doing it, we can come back to the what we do. And so this is why I agree with everyone, and we've been discussing all week, and so this is why we're here. We want to do this initial alignment piece of, and so going back to buildings, so we want to get to near zero emission buildings. Where do the emissions of the buildings come from? Materials, mostly steel and cement, heating and cooling. And they need to be resilient for our future world. So these are the 4 things that buildings need to be near zero ready for compatible. And therefore, these are the key things we need to align. These important things at the time where it matters. So next year, we're going to come back here and we'll have some initial idea of how we align this, because it's not that complicated and we just have to focus on the bits that matter most. And even if it's a bit wrong, it's something for everyone to criticize rather than nothing at all.
Thank you for that, Melanie. I hope you have that somewhere written down. You spoke so fast, I wasn't able to keep up, but very clear areas where we can work on. Thank you. Ryan, may I ask you to answer to whatever you wanted to say, but also maybe the capacity building piece, because that is a priority area that ICC is actually leading. Because we still hear a lot, many countries don't have energy codes. Now you're talking whole life carbon. How is that gonna happen?
Yeah, so I think they actually marry pretty well, and I'm glad Melanie brought up the buildings breakthrough, because there is sort of activity primarily through Priority Action 1 around sort of harmonization around definitions and standards, and I think that's happening sort of at the higher level of, sort of what are the principles that, we actually need to address. And then, sort of what Tim's talking about and what we've talked about is sort of taking that one level deeper of, we have those principles, but how do you actually sort of find that common ground of how do we actually apply them and realize them? And so I think, we're certainly interested in continuing that dialogue to figure out sort of how do we actually get to where we need to be on the harmonization front. The other piece is Priority Action Area 5 around capacity and skills. And so what we've done is really identify sort of the ecosystem that needs to be in place to effectively achieve those near zero emission and resilient buildings. And it's about both institutions and personnel. And so figuring out sort of what are the strategies, what are the skills, what are the resources that those institutions and those personnel really need to help sort of move us forward. So I think, as we talk about whatever it is, whether it's operational, embodied, resilience, we need sort of that mechanism to make things work effectively. And if you don't have sort of that underlying ecosystem in place, you're not going to be able to accomplish any of those things. And so if we can think about sort of getting in place the necessary sort of resources and sort of strategies and solutions, we can build off of those to get to embodied carbon and whole life cycle sort of approaches. So depending on sort of where various different countries are, we need to figure out sort of where do we start from, but really be able to sort of provide those tools to get to ultimately that whole life cycle basis.
I'd like to thank you so much for these introductory remarks. I think there is a lot already happening, a clear plan, as I hear. As I said, I couldn't keep track, but I like to fast forward to COP30 and really see us come with a piece of work. As you say, buildings breakthrough is where we can now really align. And I like your link to the cement work, steel, etc., Melanie. And really thank you for connecting those into it as well. Just reminding that I think this week or the weekend at the GCCA pavilion, they launched the definitions for low carbon concrete together with UNIDO and IDDI. So there's lots happening. For me, this COP is where I really surface many things that are happening, particularly in this sector. So thank you very much. I'd like to now hand back to you, Rama. Thank you for giving us the time for this initial conversation. And now we're very curious to hear how the group you've been working with, how they've progressed and what they want to share. Thank you.
So, up to you. Welcome back. That was such a fascinating panel and really lined us up incredibly well for this proof of concept that we're going to go into some quite detail, because all the questions that were addressed in that panel were exactly questions that we were asking. And so when we brought together 6 of the largest AEC firms in the world to address this issue, we had all these questions and we together thought about how do we answer them and how do we make it something that we can handle. So I really loved what Mel had to say about not everybody using the same database, and we actually go into that, and I started laughing, and hopefully that's was not audible online, but when Tim was talking about apples and apples, and you will see why I giggled when you see my presentation. So welcome back to the Industry Alignment on BIM Data Decarbonization of Buildings panel. So there might be some forward-looking I work for Autodesk, we're a private company, so there may be some forward-looking statements in this presentation, so I include the safe harbor statement. We once had a conference where we had Elvis sing the safe harbor statement, which was really amusing. Well, an Elvis impersonator. And I think this session is going to be a little bit different from most panels because you'll have a tremendous amount of context setting, which we have to do because of the nature of this proof of concept. And we want to make sure that we bring you along with us on this exploration. This was months in the works, and so I really want to make sure that you understand kind of where this work came from and how we came to these conclusions. I just introduced myself, so again, I'm the liaison delegate to the WBCSD, and as we thought about, as part of my partnership role, like what I do at Autodesk, I seek opportunities to catalyze collective action and to drive sustainable outcomes. And through our membership with the WBCSD, we really thought about how can we use Autodesk technology to solve sector-wide sustainability challenges? How can we bring together a cohort of companies to address the issues that we're all facing? So we're here because of the WBCSD's Buildings Breakthrough and the market transformation. And we really wanted to think about how can we leverage digitalization to achieve our decarbonization targets. We joined the WBCSD about 3 years ago, and we focused, they have different tracks, and we were focused on the built environment. Autodesk, of course, works across multiple industries, but in this case, we really wanted to focus on one thing. And last year, it's kind of a year and a half ago, at the London Climate Action Week, we had a workshop with several different companies and at Arup. And we brainstormed, what can we do together? Like, we did a whole whiteboard with all our stickies, and we said, what can we do together that will, under the auspices of the WBCSD, that will drive decarbonization in the built environment? What is actionable that we can do? And like any proof of concept, like the proof of concept, is this worth the proof of concept is not the work. It's like, is this a question worth asking, right? And so that's what we did with this proof of concept, and it clearly came out that it was not only a question worth asking, it was a question worth answering. And I'll say this at the end, but personally, this was such an incredibly rewarding experience. So working under the auspices of the WBCSD and with 6, frankly, competitors, and the level of transportation and transparency and communication and desire to do better, to not say, well, we're going to stick with what we do because, I think Nigel said this yesterday in a panel, if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to transform, go together. So the impetus of this project was to advance the industry, right, in consistent reporting of life cycle assessment, LCA, which you just heard about, which I think many people already know who are listening to this talk. And we considered that the North Star, right, of our collection action for impact. However, when we initiated the project idea, we sketched out the value chain and all the data inputs. And as you heard on this panel, there are many. And we realized that we couldn't solve all the parts of the system at once. Right, so we said, let's take this opportunity to focus on just one slice of the life cycle to understand the digitalization process we undertake to get towards a full LCA. So the project aim was to identify the various BIM methods and analysis processes for measuring and calculating carbon. I'm on the wrong slide. I'm switching it on my laptop, but not on the screen. And to seek alignment and understand differences in our professional practices. The long-term goal is that this proof of concept will start to uncover, and we believe it has, and future work may expand upon in enabling the streamline and standardization of these processes for the industry. It was a 6-month project schedule. All 6 firms worked on the same Revit model, which I'll share more about shortly, and having one model to measure embodied carbon freed up the cohort in many ways, not to mention IP issues, but also as an artificial building, because it was just a render of a building that Autodesk had created, it created some limitations. I also wanted to take a step back. I think at a conference like this, there's a lot of very high-level thought leadership concepts. And the reason why I wanted to put the whole team here is this was very technical work. We really needed the practitioners who are doing the embodied carbon assessment to understand the process and what we were getting to, and they also needed executive support within their companies, right? Because architecture and engineering firms get paid by the job. So this was volunteer time of these companies to improve the industry, and that is not to be underappreciated. That was a tremendous contribution of time and effort toward the industry. And this level of expertise is exactly what we needed to collect, to synthesize, to extract the data that we needed to formulate best practices, and to trust that we would help establish these best practices for the industry. So once again, really acknowledge the work and the commitment that came into a project of this type. So what was in it for them, right? So how did they convince their executive teams that it was okay to volunteer this time and work like this, right? So currently every firm is creating its own methodology, right? They're for creating BIM data. And this proof of concept, the idea was to streamline and standardize this process to save time and duplicative efforts, right, across the industry to potentially make communication across project players more aligned. Also, the WBCSD created this incredible neutral environment in which we could collectively approach to this project to achieve whole life carbon data reporting. And also these are, like as I mentioned, these are all global firms, but individually, not Autodesk, not Ramble, not Arup, not Foster & Partners could do this alone. Collectively, we had much more ability to transform the industry than any of us would individually. Also, we wanted to pull back the curtain on some of like the firm practices, right? To share and learn at a deep level from peer and other companies. People keeping their kind of secret sauce of their companies, but also sharing with transparency. And then also, look, the regulatory requirements for the built environment are here or they're coming. And so by participating in this proof of concept, the outcome of which brought, key learnings and best practices for the industry, each cohort participant would get a seat at the table for helping to drive what was going to come out of the upcoming regulations, right? So it gave us an opportunity collectively to influence what was coming and to shape best practices moving forward in terms of carbon reporting and benchmarking. The one thing that we kept clear the entire time was that we really wanted to identify the BIM as it impacts LCA methods and to identify best practices for the industry. So now I'm going to give you a little bit more on the actual project. So what did we do? So one of the key reasons WBCSD, Autodesk, and the 6 companies got together was to address this topic is because we know that decarbonization is an imperative for the AEC industry. Several countries, it would be probably helpful if I advance the slides, not just on my laptop. We know that decarbonization is an imperative for the AEC industry. And similarly, the voluntary benchmarking realm, sustainable building standards also have diverse requirements, both for LCA and spatial boundaries. This means it's very difficult to design toward benchmarks established from apples to apples comparisons of buildings and ultimately make good decisions as an industry. So that was my giggle on the apples. So how do we know if we've designed a good apple when we're comparing a shelf of apples and peaches and papayas? We need aligned standards and methods so we can design better, move faster, and address the climate emergency. Today, we have many tools, data sets, calculators. You heard all about that in the last panel discussion, which result in many paths to get from BIM to LCA. However, practitioners really just want an efficient, streamlined method. Oh, Jesus. This is really challenging my brain to do both. I ruined my joke. So they want to get, there needs to be a direct access to get from BIM to CO2 development. We also needed to use the same project or a BIM model. So we landed on Snowden Towers. Snowden Towers is a free model that comes with Revit 2024 that's available to anyone. It has no IP. It's accessible to anyone with Revit 2024, which means it can be replicated by anyone regardless of whether they were part of this cohort or not. And it includes the project scopes we needed. It represents a fairly developed but not overly designed phase of the project, which means it also includes some, but not every single piece of documentation for a project. providing enough to represent a project in which we have a fair amount of data and still lots of room to unpack the question of firm-specific practices. Other decisions made were simplifying the model, facade materials, and assumptions. Deciding what spatial elements to include, the Revit model has thousands of tiny bits. What is actually needed to get to the purpose of our study? Our cohort members are all volunteering their time, so we wanted to be mindful and followed the 80-20 rule. So I think that actually this speaks to what Mel was talking about. We wanted 20% of the materials for 80% of the impact. This chart shows volume by material in the model. Most of it is from specific elements. Informed alignment around which elements to include or exclude within those material types, and additional assumptions made to capture non-modeled characteristics. Other assumptions, not asking firms to create design options as part of the exercise to focus on translation of BIM to carbon, provided basic assembly assumptions. Deciding what spatial elements to include, the Revit model. We even questioned how to actually report out the calculation. So we had, right, Tim here from RICS. As a cohort, we decided to align reporting with the RICS V2 whole LCA guidelines. And as you know, RICS is the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. You just heard from him. This was a critical step to determine how we then needed to structure the carbon data. The output results in a granular reporting of materials and their carbon impact dependent on which project phase you're in. This framework helped us compare quantities and carbon factors used by each firm line by line. Another benefit in this is the real project reporting template. Again, implementing something that can be replicated for other projects. We wanted to use a preset template because our focus on this proof of concept was not the structure of the LCA report, but unpacking the BIM practices to get from the model to the output. We didn't need to pick RICS specifically. This proof of concept could be run in other reporting frameworks and find similar outcomes. And also, it could be done with other BIM models and other BIM software. These are just the decisions we made as a cohort. For the purpose of our study, So now I'm going to get to introducing the fantastic panel of speakers. I want to introduce all the experts from the group who will be joining us virtually. Of course, we have Nigel here on stage, but we have 4 practitioners virtually. One is a video because he's actually presenting at University of Bath this morning, so he couldn't be on this call. So I'm going to kick it off with Margarita Goncalves from Arcadis, and please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Rama. I am Margarida Gonçalves. I am based in Lisbon, Portugal, and I work in Arcadis as a global sustainability impact specialist in the life cycle assessment methodology. Thank you.
Thank you, Margarita. And now we have we're going to have Mirko. He's the one who's in Bath, so he pre-recorded us a video. Is this going to play? Oh, missed it.
Hi, I'm Mirko Farnetani, the SOM firm-wide embodied carbon leader. Sorry I couldn't join virtually, but I have recorded this intro and I will share details on the themes on non-model elements later in the panel. Thank you.
Excellent. Over to you, Blerina from Foster & Partners.
Hi, thank you, Rama. My name is Blerina Celnicco. I'm associate partner at Foster & Partners based in London, and I'm a BIM lead for sustainability.
And next I'd like to call out Ines Idzikowski and Ederne San Miguel from AECOM.
Thank you, Rama. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ines Idzikowski. I'm the Sustainable Design Lead for AECOM, and I'm based in Madrid.
And now Monica from Rambo. Oh wait, we missed Ederne.
Yeah. Thank you, Rama.
You're on screen.
Okay, so I'm Edurne San Miguel, digital lead here in ICOM Spain, and I have been contributing, coordinating the digital effort for this proof of concept.
And Monica from Rumble.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Monica Lucas, and I'm actually a structural engineer, but I work at Rumble as a section manager for a group called Sustainable Buildings, where we are very active towards decarbonization in projects, but also within the company. And I'm based in Oslo, Norway.
Excellent. Then we actually have somebody here in person. Over to you, Nigel.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Nigel Tonks from Arup, and I'm a sustainable development consultant with Arup, and I'm actually representing. I would like to just credit Jason Burke from our office, who was the engineer that worked closely on this project with Rama. Was unable to attend today, and he graciously invited me to give the presentation on his behalf. So I just wanted to credit Jason. So good afternoon.
And actually, speaking of credit, I would really like to thank my colleagues on the Building Solutions team, Marta Bouchard and Sheena Jong, who really drove this work. I mean, I've said this before, and I feel like I say it every time, but just the level of transparency among the group was so impressive that it needs to be called out. So basically, we had key findings, right, from this report that we did. We organized it into 6 main topic themes, right, and we want to provide an overview of the complexities involved in embodied carbon assessment. So we're going to start with Margarida from Arcadis, and she's going to speak to the work that they did. Well, they all did the same work, but the portion of the work, and she's going to be focusing on the embodied carbon assessment process.
Thank you, Rama. So I will first explore the embodied carbon assessment process followed by Arcadis. The current process in practice for validated certification follows different steps with different experts involved. Namely, architects provide detailed drawings from the building modeling software, which go to a quantity surveyor who makes the bill of quantities linked to costs. Then, this list goes to a sustainability consultant who calculates the carbon assessment using an LCA software. However, here, the carbon assessment results only appear at the end of the process, when decisions have already been made. And if the carbon assessment results suggest that carbon savings could be achieved by implementing low carbon designs or the selection of low carbon materials, these changes are often time and cost consuming and difficult to fully implement because we will need to start the process from the beginning once again. In Arcadis, we empower structural engineers and architects in sustainability. So in this proof of concept, my colleague Kiva, who is an architect, used the building modeling software, the Revit, and we used a plugin to import the data to an LCA software, namely the OneClick. What are the lessons learned from our side? So the use of a plugin linked to the modeling software, to the LCA software, helps to insert data for a quicker carbon assessment. This allows the architect to get feedback on carbon before the design is finalized and to make the required adjustments to decrease the embodied carbon. This workflow speeds up carbon assessments by involving fewer parties, adding decision-making, and allowing these adjustments during the design process. Well, about limitations. This process doesn't target certification. For that, we will need the sustainability consultant to review the carbon analysis. And if you aim to map the risk categories, you should use a specific carbon assessment tool that automatically will link the materials and structures with the specific risk categories. Otherwise, it will be time consuming because you will need to do it manually. as we did in this work, because at that time we did not have this specific calculation tool available. And a lesson learned is this in this work was that it's very important to allocate some time to verify the default data the LCA software selects and correct this information in the material mapping. For example, in this study, some duplicate elements appeared and a few incorrect materials were selected by default in the LCA software. So we spent some time doing these corrections manually in the LCA software. As a measured conclusion, linking in this case Revit with the one-click LCA improves design choices, fostering sustainability in projects, and also just to mention, because it was discussed in the previous panel, one-click as a good database of environmental product declarations, the so-called EPDs. Rama, next slide, please. And this is my last slide. So we already discussed this, and you know that the all life carbon includes the embodied, but also the operational carbon. In fact, nowadays we are giving more importance to the embodied carbon because with the net zero strategies,